Have you ever watched the news and just thought, how is this even possible? A hurricane claiming lives, an illness taking a loved one, a war destroying everything in its path. And in that moment, a question arises in our minds, one that has tormented humanity for thousands of years. If there's an all-powerful, all-knowing and perfectly good God, why does he allow any of this to happen? Today, we're not going to offer easy answers. Instead, we're diving into the very heart of that philosophical storm known as the problem of evil. We'll dissect the strongest arguments from both sides, and I promise you, by the end of this video, your perspective on this age-old question will never be the same. So, let's start by setting the stage. This paradox was first clearly articulated by the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. It goes something like this. If God wants to prevent evil but can't, then he's not all-powerful. If he can but doesn't want to, then he's not good. If he can and wants to, then where does evil come from? And if he can't and doesn't want to, then why call him God at all? This is the puzzle we'll be grappling with today. Alright, to untangle this complex issue, let's begin with a simple yet crucial step. Imagine you're trying to fix a complex mechanism. The first thing you do is take it apart to understand how it functions. We'll approach the problem of evil in the same way. We can't just lump everything together. Philosophers and theologians typically divide evil into two broad, fundamentally distinct types. The first type is moral evil. This one is fairly straightforward. It encompasses all the harm people intentionally inflict upon one another. Wars, genocide, betrayal, deceit, theft, cruelty. The list is endless. The crucial point here is that these are actions originating from human choice. The source of this evil is human decision, our choices and our deeds. This is evil with a human author. The second type, however, is far more complex. This is natural evil. A hurricane that wipes an entire city off the map. An earthquake claiming thousands of lives. A child born with an incurable illness. A virus triggering a pandemic. This type of evil has no human author. It simply happens. It strikes us from outside, and we often feel defenseless against it. Grasping this distinction is critically important, because the arguments used to explain the cruelty of one person simply don't apply when we're talking about a tsunami. And this very distinction will serve as our roadmap for our journey ahead. Alright, let's delve into the issue of moral evil. This is where, arguably, the most famous and powerful argument in this entire discussion comes into play, the free will defense. At its core is a simple idea. God values our freedom more than our guaranteed safety. Let's unpack that. According to this concept, God's ultimate goal wasn't to create a utopian world where everyone is always happy. Instead, it was to create beings capable of genuine love, true virtue, and meaningful relationships. And what's the fundamental prerequisite for all of that? Free choice. Imagine for a moment if God had created a world populated by robots, programmed solely to do good. They would never lie, betray, or inflict pain. Sounds appealing, doesn't it? But their love and goodness would be utterly meaningless. They'd just be lines of code. You can't force genuine love. Sincerity is born only from freedom. Now, true freedom isn't just about choosing between vanilla and chocolate ice cream. It's the profound ability to choose between good and evil. If you lack the genuine option to choose evil, then your choice for good isn't a choice at all. It's a predetermined outcome. Your yes holds no meaning without the power to say no. So moral evil isn't something God created. It's the terrible, tragic cost of our greatest gift, free will. But what good is genuine freedom if we can't truly choose evil? According to this idea, the very ability to make wrong choices is the unavoidable price we pay for a world where love and goodness can truly flourish. God could easily step in and stop any evildoer, but in doing so, he would be taking back his own gift. He would effectively turn us from free individuals into mere puppets. Naturally, a rather tricky question immediately arises from this. Why wouldn't an all-powerful God simply create beings who, of their own free will, invariably choose only good? It sounds logical enough. However, Proponents of this view argue that it's logically impossible, akin to creating a square circle. If the outcome of a choice is predetermined, meaning we are guaranteed to choose good, then it's not freedom at all, but a highly convincing illusion. It's like railway tracks disguised beneath a road. You might turn the steering wheel, but the train will invariably follow its preset route. Genuine freedom, they contend, demands genuine risks, and moral evil is precisely that risk come to life. The argument for free will often sound pretty solid, at least when we're discussing human behaviour. But let's be honest, it completely falls apart the moment we confront natural evil. Free will offers no explanation for why a volcano suddenly erupts and incinerates an entire village. It doesn't explain why a tsunami claims the lives of tens of thousands, including infants. And it certainly can't account for why a child is born with an agonizing genetic illness. No one chose this. There's no human malice involved. It's simply the blind, relentless force of nature. And to grapple with this kind of suffering, theologians and philosophers put forward another powerful and, frankly, quite stark argument. This is the idea of the so-called soul-making world. Instead of seeing our world as a comfortable home, let's picture it more like a gym, or perhaps even a rigorous military boot camp. Under this concept, our primary purpose here on earth isn't comfort or pleasure, but rather spiritual growth and the forging of our character. This world isn't a blissful resort. Instead, it serves as a spiritual training ground for the soul. Proponents of this idea, like the philosopher John Hick, contend that difficulties, challenges, and even suffering are essential for us to grow. They're vital for us to become stronger, to cultivate compassion, courage, patience, and empathy. In a world devoid of pain, there could be no compassion. Without dangers, courage would be unnecessary. And without injustice, there'd be no fight for truth. This implies that all these dreadful things, from illnesses to natural catastrophes, are precisely the equipment that shapes our character. They force us out of our comfort zones, compelling us to grow and improve. They create the conditions for us to demonstrate our finest qualities. Without the challenges posed by what we perceive as natural evil, this theory suggests we would remain infantile beings, incapable of either empathy or heroism. Imagine a world free from all problems. No one ever gets sick, goes hungry, or faces danger. No earthquakes, no viruses, no pain. In such an utterly safe and sterile world, there would simply be no fertile ground for virtues like courage, compassion, or self-sacrifice to manifest. What need is there for courage when you face no threats? Why show compassion if no one suffers? In such a world, proponents of this idea argue, we would never become who we are meant to be. It would be a world of perpetual children, not mature individuals. Therefore, what we perceive as natural evil isn't mindless cruelty. It's the necessary backdrop against which the drama of our spiritual formation unfolds. It's a harsh, yet effective tool for soul-making. It compels us to help each other after a disaster, to care for the sick, to seek cures, and to grow stronger in the face of adversity. Yet this perspective isn't without its critics, and their objections are often incredibly compelling. They pose a simple, yet profoundly uncomfortable question. Is the price truly justified? Does fostering compassion in one individual truly necessitate another's journey through unbearable torment? Let's consider the most extreme example. A 1-year-old child dying of cancer. What could they possibly learn? What virtues could they develop? Their suffering seems utterly meaningless and without purpose. Or consider the Holocaust. Can one seriously argue that millions of tortured individuals were merely a training exercise to instill courage in the survivors? To many, the sheer scale of suffering in our world seems grotesquely disproportionate to this supposed educational goal. Critics argue that if this is a school, its methods are so brutal, they more closely resemble a torture chamber. They maintain that a benevolent God could surely have devised more humane ways for our spiritual development. All right, since previous arguments often leave us with more questions than answers, let's explore another popular concept. This is often referred to as the greater good defense, or the bigger picture argument. At its core, The idea suggests that some of the suffering we perceive as meaningless and utterly terrible is, in fact, necessary to achieve a larger, higher good, a good that we, in our current state, simply cannot comprehend. Think of a small child screaming and crying when a doctor gives them a painful injection. The child experiences only the immediate pain and fear. They don't understand that this shot will protect them from a serious illness in the future. Their perspective is just too limited. Similarly, this theory proposes that we too see only a tiny fragment of a vast, universal mosaic. We witness the pain, but we don't grasp the ultimate purpose. God, much like that wise physician, sees the entire picture. He permits what seems like evil in the moment because it's an essential part of a grand, benevolent plan that will ultimately lead to the best possible outcome. The core problem with this approach is its complete lack of verifiability. It's akin to telling someone, just be patient. Eventually, it will all make sense. For those suffering in the here and now, this offers very little solace. This argument demands not just reflection, but blind faith that such an invisible, grandiose plan genuinely exists and is truly benevolent. Critics often compare this to excusing a tyrant's actions by claiming their cruelty serves some unseen, higher purpose. It's a remarkably convenient position precisely because it's utterly unfalsifiable. Any evil, no matter how monstrous, can be attributed to an inscrutable design. But for many, this answer rings hollow. It sounds like an evasion of responsibility, an attempt to mask divine powerlessness or indifference with lofty talk of the greater good. It leaves a bitter taste. Does the best of all possible worlds truly demand such horrific ingredients? But what if we're looking at the problem all wrong? What if evil itself isn't quite what we imagine it to be? Here we turn to the insights of one of Christianity's greatest thinkers, Saint Augustine. He proposed a remarkably elegant, albeit sophisticated concept known as the privation theory of evil. Augustine asserted that God, being perfectly good, could not have created evil. Evil, he argued, isn't some distinct opposing force or entity, battling good like the dark side against the light in Star Wars. Instead, according to Augustine, evil is an absence or a corruption of good. It's simpler to understand this with a few examples. Darkness isn't a thing in itself, it's merely the absence of light. Cold isn't a substance, it's the absence of heat. Silence isn't a sound, it's the absence of sound. Similarly, Augustine viewed evil as a hole in the fabric of existence. It's a place where good ought to be, but for some reason isn't. Illness is the absence of health. Hatred is a distorted, corrupted form of love. God created only what is good, and evil arises as its perversion, a deviation from the norm. It's a truly elegant philosophical concept. It absolves God of responsibility for the creation of evil, positing him as an ideal sculptor who carves a beautiful statue, only for cracks and chips to later appear. He didn't create the imperfections. They arose from the inherent flaws or degradation of the material itself. While beautiful in theory, this concept, like many others, inevitably collides with the harsh reality of human experience. When someone is suffering from torture or a debilitating illness, they frankly don't care whether their pain is merely an absence of good or a self-existent negative force. Pain is pain, plain and simple. This theory may work well in philosophical treatises, but to someone grappling with real tragedy, it can feel like a cruel mockery. To tell them that their suffering is merely a distortion of good is to invalidate their entire experience. Critics argue that while this theory brilliantly solves a logical puzzle, it completely disregards the emotional and existential dimensions of the problem. Let's now shift our focus and approach this problem from a completely different perspective. What if our fundamental understanding of omnipotence is flawed? We tend to think that omnipotent means being capable of absolutely anything imaginable. However, many theologians and philosophers, such as Thomas Aquinas, argue that this isn't quite accurate. They contend that omnipotence doesn't entail the ability to do what is logically impossible. For instance, Even an omnipotent God cannot create a square circle or draw a four-sided triangle. He cannot make 2 plus 2 equal 5. This isn't a limitation of divine power. Rather, these are simply nonsensical phrases, logical contradictions. Now, some thinkers extend this same principle to the problem of evil. Perhaps they suggest creating a world with genuinely free beings, yet one where evil and suffering are guaranteed to be absent, is precisely that kind of logical impossibility, like a square circle. Perhaps freedom and the risk of evil are inherently and inextricably linked by their very nature, and thus, in granting one, God inevitably permitted the possibility of the other, not out of malevolence, but because logically there was no other way. A more radical perspective exists, one that completely upends traditional notions of God. It's known as process theology. Its proponents ask, what if God isn't an all-powerful dictator, pulling strings from a heavenly throne? What if God isn't omnipotent in the classical sense? In this model, God is not seen as an absolute controller, but rather as a co-creator who evolves alongside the universe. He doesn't create the world out of nothing with a snap of his fingers, but rather influences, persuades, and guides it, much like a loving parent or a wise teacher. He sets a direction towards goodness, harmony, and beauty, but cannot fully control the chaotic and free elements of the world, including us. In this worldview, God doesn't merely permit suffering. He suffers with us. He feels every pain, every loss. He cannot magically fix everything, but he constantly works within the world to draw good out of tragedy and guide everything towards a better outcome. This is a profoundly unique perspective that absolves God of inaction, but at the cost of his omnipotence. But how is this perennial question approached outside the confines of Western Judeo-Christian thought? Let's briefly shift our focus to the East, where radically different perspectives on the problem of suffering can be found. For instance, in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, the concept of karma plays a pivotal role. Within this worldview, there's no room for arbitrary or unjust suffering. Karma is understood as a universal and impersonal law of cause and effect. Everything you experience in this life, good or bad, is a direct consequence of your actions, performed either in this life or in previous ones. If you are suffering, it implies you once inflicted suffering upon others. Conversely, if you enjoy happiness, it's believed you earned it through your virtuous deeds. This approach entirely sidesteps questions directed at a divine being. Here, there's no capricious or inactive deity to hold accountable. Instead, there is only an immutable universal law of justice. While this is a highly logical and coherent system, it's not without its complexities. It can, for example, lead to fatalism, and even the justification of social inequality. After all, if someone is poor or ill, it suggests they are responsible for their situation due to past karma. And finally, there's one last argument, one that, depending on your perspective, could be seen as either the height of wisdom or a clever dodge to avoid an uncomfortable truth. This is the concept of the incomprehensibility of God's design. Its essence is simple. With our tiny, limited human minds, we are simply incapable of grasping the motives, plans, and very nature of an infinite, transcendent being. To attempt to judge God from the vantage point of our human logic and morality is like an ant crawling across a Rembrandt canvas, trying to comprehend the artist's entire vision while seeing only a single brushstroke. We witness suffering and perceive it as meaningless evil. But perhaps, from the colossal perspective of eternity, this suffering holds a purpose we cannot even begin to fathom. This argument calls for humility. It essentially preaches trust, even when you don't understand. For many people of faith, this is the most honest, and indeed, the only possible answer. But for skeptics, it often rings hollow, sounding like an intellectual capitulation, a refusal to seek rational explanations, and a convenient justification for any tragedy. We've journeyed through a labyrinth of ideas together: free will, suffering as a school for the soul, the greater good, evil as the absence of good, karma, the inscrutability of God. So, what's the conclusion? It's this: not one of these arguments taken in isolation provides an exhaustive or fully satisfying answer. Each theory solves one piece of the puzzle, but leaves gaping holes in another. The defense of free will doesn't explain cancer. The idea of suffering as a soul gym seems cruel when we consider infants dying of starvation. And perhaps this is where the crucial turning point lies. What if the problem of evil isn't an equation to be solved? What if it's not an intellectual puzzle, but an existential challenge? Perhaps this question isn't meant for us to ponder from an armchair, debating God, but rather to inspire us to rise up and act when we witness suffering. Maybe the answer to why does God allow this is that He's waiting for us to combat this evil with compassion, help, mercy, and love. Perhaps our response to evil is, in fact, part of God's answer. Ultimately, the problem of evil remains an open question. It's an eternal dialogue between faith and doubt, between hope and despair. And perhaps the absence of a simple answer is precisely its greatest significance. It compels us to think, to feel, and most importantly, to act. Thank you for joining us on this complex journey. If this video has sparked your thoughts, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our future explorations of challenging topics. Now, a question for you. Which of these arguments do you find most compelling? Or perhaps you believe the only truly honest answer is I don't know. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss.